So we've heard from Richard and Adrian about market definition and how to assess it, but we've also heard that market definition is really just part of the process of assessing market power, which is what we really care about when we are doing competition policy and antitrust. But what is market power? Well, I find the easiest way to think about market power is as the opposite to competition. But what is competition? So competition can be thought of as the competitive constraints facing a firm. If a firm raises its price, reduces its quality, stops innovating, it risks losing customers to competitors. And if it loses too many customers to competitors, then that decision will actually prove to be unprofitable. And that means that the competitive constraints on that firm are so high that the firm doesn't have market power. However, if the competitive constraints are weaker, so if it can raise its price, reduce quality or stop innovating without losing so many customers to its competitors, so that turns out to be profitable, then that means that firm does have market power. In legal terms, it can behave to an appreciable extent independently of its competitors. And that concept of market power as a weakening of competitive constraints is very relevant when we're looking at mergers. And in fact, in mergers, what we're usually interested in is the market power delta, the change in market power resulting from the merger. How much does the merger relax the competitive constraints on the firms who are merging? How much, therefore, does it lessen competition? So if market power is the weakening of competitive constraints, then assessment of market power involves looking at these levels of competitive constraints. And essentially, there are three forms of competitive constraint that we tend to look at in antitrust and competition policy. Firstly, we tend to look at existing competition, the competitors that the firm is already facing in the market, that already place a competitive constraint on the firm. Secondly, we tend to look at potential competition, firms that are maybe currently outside the market or maybe haven't even come into existence yet, but could potentially come into the market and constrain the firm if the firm were to behave in a way that was not in the interests of consumers in terms of maybe exploiting its price or behaving anti-competitively. And the third kind of constraint that we look at is the constraint that comes from buyer power. Sometimes buyers are sufficiently strong that they have additional ways to protect themselves against the behaviour of their suppliers and ensure that their suppliers really do compete effectively, sometimes even when there's only a few of them. We're now going to look at each of those types of constraint in a little bit more detail. So if we start with existing competition, first of all, we often draw inferences about market power from the existing market shares in the market that we have defined using the techniques that we talked about earlier. And that can provide a good first indicator of market power. Indeed, it can do more than that. So in the EU, there is legal precedent that actually says that if you have 70% of a relevant market, then under the law, it can be presumed that you are dominant, strongly presumed. If you have above 50% of a market, then there is a rebuttable presumption that you have market power as a firm. So therefore, you are presumed to have market power, but it can be rebutted if you come up with reasons why that is a false presumption. And above 40%, you can still be found to have market power, although you do need to have other pieces of evidence as well. Likewise, in the US merger guidelines of 2010, which are currently being revisited, so the precise wording may change, but in the current guidelines, there is guidance for firms relating to the concentration in market and the change in concentration arising from merger in terms of what the implications are for the likelihood of harm from a merger and the likelihood that the authorities will take an interest. Specifically, if concentration as measured by the HHI index, and I'll come back to what that means shortly, is below 1500, so the market is relatively unconcentrated, and if the delta, so the change in market concentration, is below 100, then the guidelines suggest it's highly unlikely that this merger will raise problems. By contrast, if the concentration HHI is above 2,500 and the delta in HHI, so the change in concentration, is above 200, so it's a relatively bigger change in concentration, then the guidelines say that this is a merger that the authorities are relatively likely to take an interest in. Doesn't mean that it's definitely a problematic merger, but it does mean that it's relatively more likely to receive scrutiny. So if we're placing weight on market shares and concentration when we're assessing market power, it's worth just giving a little bit of consideration to how we measure market share and concentration. Market share is often calculated on the basis of value. So a firm's total turnover as a share of total turnover in the relevant market, for instance. But it can also be calculated on the basis of volume, so a firm's total sales volume or customers or users as a share of the total sales volume, customer or users in the relevant market. Which of these measures of share we go for to some extent depends on practicality, what figures can we actually get, but to some extent also depends on relevance. Sometimes different shares will be relevant depending on exactly the question that we are asking. And it's often good to have as many different measures as possible so you can look at market power from a variety of different perspectives. In terms of concentration, there are generally two key measures that are used. One is simply the concentration ratio, so CR2, 3 or 4, which is the total market share of the top 2, 3 or 4 firms in a relevant market. The other measure is the HHI that I already mentioned, the Herfindahl-Hirschman index. And what that is the sum of the squares of the market shares of the firms in a market. And that can run from close to 0 for a very fragmented market where all of the firms have close to 0 market share, up to 10,000 for a monopoly where one firm has 100% market share. Even though market shares and concentration are often where we start in our assessment of market power, it is important to remember that these measures have both pros and cons. On the positive side, they are often a good first indicator or screen of market power, and in particular, firms that have low market shares or markets where there is low concentration can be relatively comfortable that they are unlikely to run foul of merger law or abuse of dominance law. Another positive is that market shares and concentration and their link to market power does fit broadly with economic theory. In particular, Corno competition shows a clear link between concentration and market power. But even outside of core competition, it's very intuitive that a firm with a very large share of a market is likely to face lesser competitive constraints on its behaviour than a firm with far lower market share in a market. So it's in line with economic theory. What market shares and concentration indices also allow us to do is to use the sorts of legal presumptions and reversals of burdens of proof that I talked about earlier in terms of the US merger guidelines and the EU precedents on dominance. And that can be, again, very useful for enabling more effective enforcement and prioritising enforcement, while nonetheless remaining broadly in line with economic theory and economic understanding. So those are the positives, but we also need to be aware that there are some very important caveats that need to be borne in mind when thinking about market shares as a guide to market power. The first is that market shares can vary very substantially over time. If one thinks, for example, about film studios, they will sometimes have blockbuster films, and therefore if they have a blockbuster film in any particular year, they may have a very high market share, particularly if no other studio had a big blockbuster. The next year they may have no blockbuster and their relative market share may fall quite dramatically. In a market like that, where your market share depends very much on whether you had one successful product in a given year, you might want to look at market shares over time rather than in any one year to give you a better picture of market power. And if they do fluctuate so dramatically, that rather indicates a lack of individual firm market power. Another issue is that market shares can more generally overstate or understate the competitive constraints on a firm. And therefore, it's really important to review a number of other factors when really doing a full assessment of market power. So the first other factor that we look at, in addition to market shares, is closeness of competition, or substitutability between firms. We've already heard a great deal about substitutability from Adrian and Richard in the context of market definition, but it is also relevant within a given market. If two firms are very close competitors in terms of their products being very substitutable, then each of those firms individually will tend to have less market power because there is such a good competitive constraint coming from the other firm. Equally, if those two firms merge, we might be more worried about a merger between those two firms who are really close competitors than we would be between two firms that are in the same market but relatively more distant competitors whose products are relatively less substitutable. So substitutability is relevant to the assessment of market power and also the change in market power resulting from a merger, even within a market. And as Adrian described, it can be measured, substitutability, through diversion ratios. Also, he didn't mention that it can also be measured via cross-price elasticities. So cross-price elasticities look at if one firm raises its price, how much of its demand goes to another firm. If that is a high number, so that other firm is getting a lot of demand when a single firm raises its price, then they are going to be relatively close substitutes. And you can get that sort of evidence on price elasticities from econometric analysis. Tends to be harder evidence to collect than diversion ratios, but can be very, very useful for assessing substitutability. More generally, the sorts of evidence that we want to collect for assessing substitutability, closeness of competition within a market is really, really similar to the sorts of evidence that Adrian was describing earlier for assessing market definition. In fact, for that reason, very often the assessment of market definition is done alongside the assessment of market power using broadly the same evidence. But just to highlight that the question we're asking is subtly different when we're looking at market power. When we're looking at market definition, we are asking, could a hypothetical monopolist of a set of products raise its price by a small and significant non-transitory increase? When we're looking at market power, we're looking at individual firm or firms, whether they could raise their price profitably. So much the same evidence is used, but the question asked just subtly different. Another important caveat to looking at market shares as evidence of market power is that sometimes there can be competition for a market, such that when we look at the market after that competition has occurred, it might look as though a firm has 100% of that market, and that might look as though it has a dominant position, but actually the initial competition occurred between a whole number of firms, and they had to compete very vigorously to win that particular contract which gave them that market. So in those sorts of bidding markets, actually high shares can be misrepresentative of market power, and in fact market power may be much lower, at least if we're looking at the initial bidding process. But nonetheless, that doesn't immediately give you a clean bill of health. First of all, even in bidding markets, we need to think, why did a firm actually win the bid? Was there something intrinsic about that firm, or was there some incumbency advantage that firm had that meant it was always going to win the bid, or it was much more able to win the bid? If so, then winning the bid may actually reflect dominance in the initial bidding stage of the process. And the other point is that even if there was plenty of competition to win the bid, depending on the question we're asking, it could be that the firm, once it has won the bid and has 100% of the market, can behave in certain ways that then restrict or distort competition. And you can certainly still have a dominant position and abuse that dominant position, even if you won the dominant position in a very competitive manner initially. Another subtlety when thinking about existing constraints on competition is whether there might be indirect competitive constraints. And these can occur in particular where customers make nested choices. Now that sounds a little bit technical. Let me give you an example. If I want a pizza tonight, I can choose initially either to go to a restaurant or to go to a grocery store and get a pizza there and have it at home. Once I'm at the restaurant or at the grocery store, I can then choose the pizza I want. And the key question there is whether a firm who is big in the sale of pizzas through grocery stores has market power because of its position in grocery stores, or whether it is constrained by the fact that if it puts prices up in grocery stores too much, I might actually choose not to go to the grocery store for a pizza at all. I might choose instead to go to a restaurant. Now, is that in fact the case? It will be an empirical question, as so often in competition policy. One needs to ask the empirical question. Here, the empirical question is, does the firm, the pizza supplier, who has a big share of sales of pizzas to grocery stores, if it raises its price, within grocery stores, clearly there'll be a little bit of direct competitive constraint from other suppliers of pizzas within grocery stores, that's clear. But if it raises its prices in grocery stores, will there be enough consumers that shift completely from grocery stores to restaurants and choose to consume a pizza in a completely different way, or not? If there aren't, if people still keep going to grocery stores and don't choose how to have their pizza on the basis of the price that this particular supplier charges within grocery stores, then that supplier will have market power, given its share in grocery stores, in the market for the sale of pizza through grocery stores. A final thing to consider when we're looking at existing competitive constraints is how easily rival firms can expand to gain the customers of a firm if that firm tries to raise its price or reduce its quality or otherwise reduce its offering to customers. If rivals can easily expand, then that will tend to reduce the market power of the firm, because when it does so, those firms can easily come in and scoop up their customers, and that will be lost profit to the firm. However, if its rival firms face barriers to expansion so that they can't so easily scoop up those customers, then that firm will tend to have greater market power because it faces less of a competitive constraint from those rivals. As a result, barriers to expansion can be really important. If there are no barriers to expansion, there will tend to be less market power. If there are higher barriers to expansion, there is likely to be more market power in a market. And when I talk about barriers to expansion, what do I mean? There can be a whole variety of different sorts of barriers to expansion. There can be consumer switching costs and search costs, so consumers may simply not know about the rivals in the market, so they might stick with a firm even though it's offering worse value for money because they just don't know what other options there are, or they may face switching costs in moving to those other options. Consumers may have behavioural biases which actually lead them to stick with their current supplier, so they may have status quo bias, default bias, they may just have other forms of bias that tend to lead to that sort of inertia, and that can equally enhance market power, act as a barrier to expansion. There can be capacity constraints, so a rival may simply not have enough capacity to expand its supply and scoop up the customers of the firm that is worsening its offer. Even if it wants to increase its capacity, it may not have access to key inputs that are needed to do that. So, for example, it might not be able to access capital very easily to invest in capacity, or in many digital markets, a key constraint is actually data. Data can be a very key input to firms seeking to deliver services to consumers. And firms with a lot of data tend to be able to feed this into their algorithms and offer a great service to consumers. Firms with less data, even if they've got great algorithms, simply can't compete as effectively without the same data. So that data can be a real constraint on firms' ability to expand in the market. And finally, there can be regulatory barriers to expansion. These can be of various forms. So, for example, in the UK, we actually have set up the water market so that water companies have a formal statutory monopoly in a local area. So there is no potential for water companies to expand into each other's areas, at least for residential customers. But these sorts of regulatory barriers can also take more unexpected forms. So, for example, there could be a regulation that says hospitals can only purchase services from suppliers that have been active for 5 years, that can mean that suppliers that are newer to the market simply can't expand into the hospital sector, for example. So as well as assessing existing competitive constraints, it's also important to think about potential competition when we're looking at market power. Are there likely to be new entrants who will create a new competitive constraint, even if in the short term a firm may appear to have market power? If so, then we may not be very worried about that market power because it will dissipate over the medium term. If we're thinking about the likelihood of that sort of entry occurring and limiting market power, it's important to think about barriers to entry. So what sorts of problems might face a firm that is trying to enter the market? And actually, it's immediately clear that many of the same barriers to expansion that I just talked about are liable to also be barriers to entry. If you can't persuade customers to search or to switch to an existing entrant, an existing player in the market, then they're certainly not going to search or switch to someone that hasn't been in the market at all. So many of the same sorts of issues and drivers arise when we're looking at barriers to entry. Sometimes what we do when we're thinking about barriers to entry is divide them into 3 key blocks. The one is absolute barriers to entry, and that can include the sorts of regulatory barriers that I was talking about earlier, and also control of key inputs. And one additional sort of key input that can be relevant for entry is actually intellectual property rights, because they can actually limit a firm from entering a market completely. For example, if you need a particular patent in order to enter a particular market. The second bucket of barriers to entry are those that are associated with market characteristics. I already mentioned customer search and switching costs and behavioural biases. We already discussed when discussing barriers to expansion, the issue around capacity constraints, and I'm going to come on it in a minute to talk about something called network effects. It's also been briefly mentioned earlier by Richard and Adrian, but I'm going to go into a little more detail. The other thing I just wanted to mention in terms of market characteristics, though, is the core issue of economies of scale and scope, and also sunk costs. Now, it is perfectly possible to enter a market that exhibits economies of scale and scope, but depending on the size of those economies of scale and scope, it may be that either you have to enter and really compete for the market and even try and drive the existing player out of the market. In that case, it's essentially those economies of scale and scope are so big that it's essentially a natural monopoly. More usually, that isn't the case, but even when that isn't the case, if you enter on a relatively small scale, you may be relatively less efficient than the much bigger rival, and therefore impose much less of a competitive constraint on that rival. And therefore, if there are big economies of scale and scope, and we think that entry is only going to be at a relatively small scale, then we might not think that that sort of entry is really going to constrain market power. Sunk costs are also very relevant here, because sunk costs are those costs that you can't recoup if you then choose to exit the market again. If you can enter freely and exit freely, then it's more likely that firms will give it a shot. They'll enter a market, see where they get to, act as a competitive constraint. If it's profitable, they'll stay in the market. If there are big sunk costs of doing that, then firms are less likely to take a gamble, and we're less likely to see that sort of entry occurring. And then there's a third bucket of barriers to entry, which are the strategic barriers. These are the sorts of things that we tend to look at when we're thinking about abuse of dominance. And it's where firms specifically engage in conduct that is designed to create or enhance a dominant position, and do so by erecting barriers to entry or indeed expansion. And the sorts of behaviours there are things like tying and bundling, predatory pricing, all the sorts of things we normally look at in abuse of dominance or monopolisation cases. So I said I'd come back to network effects, one of the market characteristics I mentioned that can act as a barrier to entry. What are network effects, first of all? Network effects occur when people value a product more if other people also use that product. As a very simple example, I am more likely to value a mobile phone if other people are on the mobile phone network and I can ring them. There's not much point in having a mobile phone and not having anyone to ring. So the value increases of my mobile phone, the more of my friends I can actually communicate with that phone. And you can have one-sided network effects like that, so me and my friends all on this network, or you can have two-sided network effects, and that's where me as a customer values a platform or network more, the more suppliers there are serving that network. And then the suppliers actually value the network more, the more customers there are on the other side. So you can get these two-sided platform effects, but the two-sided network effects, but the effect is the same in that everyone wants to be where everybody else is. And you can immediately see why this could lead to concentration in a market. In technical terms, it leads to market, or it can lead to markets tipping. Essentially, because everyone wants to go where everybody else is, the market will tend to concentrate to a situation where everybody uses the same provider, the same platform. Now, there are lots of caveats to that. That doesn't necessarily happen. If there's plenty of interoperability, as indeed there is in mobile phones. In fact, with mobile phones, I don't have to be on the same network as my friends because there is interoperability between networks and I can call them whatever network they are in fact on. And that means actually, despite the existence of network effects for mobile phones, there isn't market tipping. And that is because of the interoperability. You can also limit this tipping effect if there's lots of multi-homing. So for example, if I have two mobile phones and I can phone half my friends with that phone and half my friends with that phone, actually the market isn't going to tip because everyone's got two phones and that's fine. And so again, multi-homing by users, that's basically using more than one platform, can limit this sort of tipping. If there is lots of differentiation between platforms, there can also, that will also tend to limit tipping because people might use the platforms in different ways, and that will again tend to increase multi-homing. I use this platform for this and this platform for this, and that differentiation means that actually both platforms can continue to exist in the market. Even if we do have a market within which everybody's using the same platform, so that has actually tipped towards being highly concentrated, there is the potential for competition for the market. So for a new entrant to come in and win all of the customers, and that is possible. The difficulty is because everybody wants to be where everybody else is, there's a big coordination problem, and it can be hard to get everyone coordinated and all moving to a new platform at the same time. And so that can be a real barrier to entry or barrier to expansion, getting people to coordinate. Another aspect of market power that we tend to see for platforms where we have two-sided network effects is that sometimes you might, on one side of a market, in particular very often the customer side, have single homing customers. So I talked about multi-homing customers earlier, being those that use two phones or two platforms. Single homing customers are those that typically just use one. And what that means is if a platform has a whole set of single homing customers, then suppliers on the other side of the platform have little option, if they want to access those consumers, but to use that particular platform. And that gives the platform what is called bottleneck market power, or gateway market power, or gatekeeper market power. There's lots of different terms for that. But that kind of market power, they might be platforms that are competing very vigorously to win customers on one side of the market, but on the other side of the market, once they've won those customers, if those customers are single homing, they become a monopoly, or they have market power over the suppliers seeking to access those end consumers. So when we're assessing barriers to entry and expansion with a view to considering potential competition and indeed existing competitive constraints, what we're really interested in is how strong a competitive constraint those entrants or expanding rivals will be. And when we're looking at that, we tend to ask ourselves three key questions. First, how likely is it that the entry or expansion will actually occur? And if the barriers to entry are relatively low and the profitable opportunity is relatively high, we might think that that's relatively likely. Maybe we don't need much more evidence if we are in that position. But if the barriers to entry are relatively higher, we actually might want to get some real evidence on likelihood, for example, by going and talking to people that might be the most likely entrants. Are you thinking of it? Would you ever do it? The second question is how timely the entry may be, or expansion may be. If we may get entry or expansion, but it's only going to be in 10 years' time, that is not sufficient to constrain the market power in the near term. So what we typically look at is the entry or expansion going to happen in the next couple of years? There's no hard and fast time limit, but it tends to be that we look at the next couple of years. And finally, we look at the sufficiency of entry and expansion. I said earlier that if you have a small entrant, it's not necessarily, particularly if there's economies of scale and scope, is not necessarily going to be a very effective competitive constraint on a big player. We may find in a market that actually the only way you're really going to get a real constraint on a firm's market power is if entry is on a relatively large scale. So we need to look at the sufficiency of the entry and expansion for really limiting market power. So when you're assessing these issues of likelihood, timeliness, and sufficiency of entry or expansion, there's a number of types of evidence that can be used, drawn on. One is looking at past evidence of entry or growth, so maybe looking at either this market or other similar markets. What have we seen in terms of entry or growth of rivals? Has that occurred relatively easily, or has it in fact been very difficult and not happened? You can go and talk to competitors or potential competitors about their plans for expansion or entry. You can go and talk to customers. How realistic do customers feel new entrants or smaller rivals are as potential suppliers, or are customers really very keen to remain with their current supplier, in which case, that will tend to be a barrier to entry or expansion. You can also do quantitative or qualitative analysis of these barriers. What is it realistically going to take to get into this market? For example, will I need to invest in plant? Will I need to invest in a big advertising campaign? And then how much am I realistically likely to make once I have made those big investments if I do enter the market? Overall, does the business model for entry or expansion simply add up? If it doesn't add up, then you aren't going to get entry, you're not going to get expansion, and you're going to get greater market power. Of course, assessing barriers to entry and expansion is far from straightforward. You can collect all of this evidence and you can still make mistakes. There's a very recent piece of analysis that was commissioned by the UK Competition and Markets Authority, where they asked a consultancy to go and look at 8 mergers that they had cleared on the basis of likely entry removing any harm from the merger. What the consultants found was that in 4 of the 8 mergers, either there was no entry or the entry was not sufficient to alleviate the anti-competitive effect of the merger. So what that means is that in 4 of those 8 mergers, I mean, they were carefully chosen mergers, so it doesn't show a complete failure. These were ones where there was a real question. But in 4 of those 8 mergers, the merger either shouldn't have been cleared or certainly shouldn't have been cleared on the basis of the entry story, because the entry story turned out not to hold. So we've talked about existing competitive constraints, we've talked about potential competition. I'm now going to talk briefly about the third factor that is important in assessing market power, and that is buyer power. Now, very often in markets, there are lots and lots of small customers and they don't have any market power. The best that they can do if a firm tries to raise its price is walk away to a rival, and we've discussed the constraints that a firm faces on that basis. But if you have a big customer, that big customer has other options. It can walk away, but if it walks away, then that has a much bigger impact on the supplier than if just a few individual customers walk away. A big customer can sometimes, if it threatens to walk away from a supplier, essentially drive that supplier out of business because they comprise so much of that supplier's business. And that means the supplier has a much stronger incentive to engage with that customer and reach a price that that customer is willing to accept. And indeed, in these sorts of markets, with large customers, prices tend to be negotiated rather than set by a supplier and just accepted or not accepted by fragmented customers. Buyers can also be quite strategic in their negotiations with suppliers. So, for example, their choice of tendering process can actually be designed to increase competition between suppliers. They can flex certain aspects of the supplier's route to market. So if I'm a supermarket and the supplier wants to supply to my customers, it may be that realistically I can't walk away from that supplier completely because I have too many customers that value that supplier's product, but maybe I can give that supplier a lot less shelf space than it would ideally like for its products. Or I might put its products right at the bottom of my shelving where lots of people won't notice them, the kind of the shelf space that no suppliers really want. I can do that sort of flexing to negotiate with the supplier. If they want better shelf space, they've got to give me a better price. At an extreme, if I'm getting really frustrated with a supplier, I might even be able to foster the entry of a new supplier. I'm such a large part of the market that I might actually, if I move and to a new supplier, that might be enough output to enable a whole new supplier to enter the market and compete. And equally, I might even decide that I'm just going to integrate upstream myself, because actually I don't think I'm getting a good enough deal from this supplier. I think I could do this supply a whole lot better if I just built my own facilities. All of those sorts of strategic behaviours by buyers act to limit the seller power, the market power of sellers. That doesn't mean they have no seller power, but it does mean that you need to think in a more careful way, really thinking about the negotiation process in order to think about market power in that sort of context. Finally, sometimes it's suggested that rather than going through the whole process that I've just described of looking at existing competitive constraints and looking at potential constraints and looking at buyer power, one can go directly and look at the profitability of a firm. It is true that the profitability of a firm can be an indicator of market power, with high profitability indicating high market power. But extreme caution is needed before reaching a conclusion that high profits equate to high market power. First of all, it's really hard to know exactly what level of profit really implies market power anyway. And in some markets, what you might find is the most efficient firms making high levels of profit, the less efficient firms making much less profit, but the high levels of profit there just show and reflect efficiency in a market where there are also a whole set of less efficient firms. Profit can also be transitory. So I talked earlier about films having blockbusters. In blockbuster years, they will have high profits. Likewise, if I'm a drug company who has invested a huge amount in creating a new drug and getting the patent on that drug, the whole point of getting the patent is that I can actually extract some profit during the life of the patent on that drug by charging a price above cost during that period. The high profits on that drug during that period, they do reflect market power in a sense, but they don't reflect the kind of market power that we should be concerned about. They actually reflect a reward that is put in place by statute, the whole patent system, for that innovation. And in fact, that is a more general point, that even without patent system, firms that have really invested in innovation, in infrastructure, typically they're only going to do that if they know that over the longer term they're going to get at least some return on that. And if you don't allow them a fair return, then they won't make the investments in the first place. So all in all, even though high profits can be an indicator of market power, we typically might look at them but don't rely on them for our market power assessment.
So, Amelia, Adrian, between us, one lawyer, two economists, we've taken the people watching this series through market definition, market power. We've emphasised throughout that market power is really the most important concept in all of this. But we have in particular described the SNP test as a technique for defining markets. But there's just one thing I thought it might be worthwhile spending a little bit more time on, and it is the so-called cellophane fallacy. So the SNP test, it's a very nice conceptualization of a market. You look at a price, you hypothesize a 10% increase in that price. And that works well in a horizontal merger case, for example, because we're really looking at the market as it is now, how it will be in the future, and trying to work out whether the merger will harm competition. But of course, in the case of an abuse of dominance accusation, it may well be that the dominant firm, by virtue of being dominant, is already charging a monopoly price. So it doesn't really make much sense then to apply a SNP to that price, and it can lead to false substitutes and so on. So what I'm wondering is, for the users of our video, what to do in that situation. If price isn't the right starting point, what else can we do? Adrian, would you like to begin on that one?
Thanks, Richard. So it's a very good question, and the issue, as you say, is if prices potentially have already been raised above competitive levels, then switching evidence taken at those prices may not be informative. So you may have a broad market where switching occurs but potentially at prices that are too high, and a candidate narrow market within which a firm is dominant, which you're trying to test to understand this market power. So there are things that you can do. One would be to place lower weight on switching evidence, because remember, we've discussed that there are many other ways to understand substitutability. We could look, for example, at product characteristics. Is it, for example, the case that the nature of the product characteristics and the importance that customers place on them suggest that a narrow market makes greater sense than a broader one, for example? So that's one possibility. Another one is to consider both candidate markets and keep an open mind and say, well, look, if we have the narrow market, is dominance conceivable? Perhaps the answer is no, because even within the narrow market where shares look relatively high, it's fairly straightforward to enter that narrow space. Alternatively, in the broader market where shares are low, we may come to the same conclusion. Either way, however you look at it, no market power. Of course, it can go the other way round. We can see that in the narrow market, you may have high shares, high entry barriers. In the broad market, the same may apply. So I think let's lower weight on the switching evidence and consider other evidence more broadly.
Because that's interesting. That means we're looking at qualitative evidence as opposed to quantitative evidence, which may be a useful distinction to make. Amelia, would you like to add anything to this?
So I agree with absolutely all of that. I think another place you could look is either at the same market historically. So has there been, for example, a merger that has created the firm that we're now looking at their market position, and have prices gone up substantially since that merger? That might lead you to believe that actually the substitutability we're now seeing to other products is a result of the cellophane fallacy, and that the true competitive price, which is the price pre-merger, is rather lower. Equally, that it's historical happenstance if that happens to be the case, but there may be other geographical markets where there are similar products but different industry structures. And obviously you've got to think about whether there are differences in the demand characteristics across those markets, but very often if you've got similar markets and similar products but different industry structures, you can draw deductions about the substitutability between different products from a situation where you don't have the cellophane fallacy. So you can do that sort of thing. Another thing you could do, although it comes with some of the caveats that I placed on the profitability analysis that I talked about earlier, is you could look at the profitability of the firm, because of course if it's highly profitable, that might be suggestive of the fact that we've got a cellophane fallacy problem here.
Intuitively, it's very attractive. How are they making so much money? But Adrian, are there any dangers with using that kind of data?
Yeah, absolutely. It's not a straightforward exercise, as I think Amelia has explained. And so essentially there are two ways that one can do this, roughly speaking. Firstly, conceptually one says, well, let's have a look at the prices or margins in the market that we are interested in and compare those with prices in an otherwise identical market where we're confident that conditions are competitive. And of course, if prices are higher in the market of interest than our competitive benchmark, we might say there's a cellophane fallacy issue here. But of course, as Amelia has explained, it's pretty difficult to find a very good comparator. But that's technique number one. Technique number two is a different one. It's an assessment of whether there's excessive profitability earned by the firm, in which case prices may be too high. That's also a difficult exercise. There are ways of doing it. A common approach is to look at the return on capital employed and compare that with the weighted average cost of capital. But the trouble is, these things are difficult to measure. So, for example, the return on capital employed requires an asset base to be measured. And if assets include intangible assets such as know-how and people, as may be the case in digital markets, for example, it's very difficult to measure them confidently and accurately.
I mean, it's an obvious point to make, isn't it? But the industries, the markets that authorities look at are vastly different from one another. And one case might generate a certain kind of evidence base that another one would not. So, cliche, but every case does depend on its own facts. Amelia, did you want to add anything on the financial data point?
Not really beyond what I talked about earlier. I mean, you just have to, there are so many caveats when you're looking at profitability.
So be careful,
Yeah.
but don't rule it out.
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah. Could I just ask one last thing about this problem of knowing whether this is an abuse of dominance case, and then if it is, we've got to define a market, establish the market power, and so on. And of course, it can be very difficult. What about the idea that you know an abuse case when you see it? That there's a certain smell test or sniff test, because there are some cases where it does appear there must be something going on here. Is that useful, or is indeed that something you should put right out of your mind?
I think one has to be pretty careful with the sniff test. I would say that there are occasions where something on first sight looks pretty bad, but actually when you drill down into the context and understand why the behaviour or price is what it is, actually there can be some pro-competitive or normal competition explanations. So my preference would always be to have a very much evidence-based test. Now, of course, there will be, in reality, an iterative process where one looks at evidence on the alleged abuse, checks that it's consistent with the market definition, and as one gathers evidence on both, maybe both are updated, the assessment of abuse and the assessment of the market. So there is an iterative process, which means you can go from looking at abuse back to the market, but the emphasis for me at least is that that must be very much evidence-based.
Amelia, anything you'd like to add?
Well, I would support that, but also just really emphasise this iterative point, which is that I have known competition authorities sometimes to get an abuse of dominance allegation and then to spend an awfully long time doing market definition to assess the dominance. And then when it comes to assessing the abuse, they suddenly realise they haven't really got a theory of harm that holds together at all. So actually, I would say, even though that I agree you can't rely on the smell test, having a good smell before you even start isn't a crazy idea, because having a reasonable theory of harm and testing that just at least a little bit with the evidence you have to hand could save you an awful lot of time doing a perfect market definition when in the end you don't actually have a case.
Clearly so. Of course, there may be more than one theory of harm in a case, but,
That's also true.
but this point still holds true. Well, thank you very much. So, in this module, Adrian, Amelia and I have introduced you to various issues in relation to market definition and market power. We've introduced you to the hypothetical monopolist test, which provides a very useful thought experiment as to how to think about markets and what relevant markets consist of. And we've also introduced you to evidential methods of determining what the scope of the relevant market might be. But we have emphasised throughout the module that market definition is not an end in itself. It is a means to an end. Ultimately, we are interested in the key concept of market power. In describing these phenomena, we have introduced you to the ideas of demand-side substitutability and supply-side substitutability, but we've also discussed the kind of competitive constraints that firms might be under. Competitive constraints can come from within the relevant market as it has been defined. There we look at the existing competition within the market, but we also want to know what competition there is outside the market that might be exerted on people within it.
potential competition, if you prefer. And we've also looked at the concept of buyer power. Could it be that suppliers in a market are not able to exercise market power unduly because of constraints that are imposed upon them by significant buyers? Towards the end of the module, we discussed a number of issues, interesting issues, topical issues in relation to market definition. And we've explained that some of these at this moment, we're recording this in December of 2021, are being examined by the European Commission, and these may in due course find their way into a future notice on market definition, which the Commission may adopt by the end of 2022.